both Taziba and Mbako Sabati will be posting some questions to the audience, and you are really invited to participate, give us comments, and help us to set the scene for Dr. Mbo's presentation. After that, there will be another opportunity for questions and engagement, and we will be closing at 7:15, at the latest 7:20. It is my understanding that the Minister of Health will be addressing the Botswana nation tonight on COVID at 7:30. So we will definitely finish by 7:20 at the latest to allow people enough time to get to their televisions and radios to hear the minister speak. Some house rules: please use your video if you are comfortable. We love to see where you are and who you are, and welcome all of you. But may I please ask you to keep your microphone on mute for the benefit of the speaker and the facilitators. But if you want to raise a question, please unmute. We can also assist with that. I welcome everybody again who has joined us now in this room for this exciting evening of discussion on state enterprises. And as I've just mentioned, we will be finishing in time before the Minister of Health addresses the Botswana nation. This webinar is hosted by our Botswana chapter. In front of you, you will also note there is a chat box. Please make use of the chat box. Post your questions in the chat box to the facilitator, who will be raising your questions to the speaker. And to start off this session, Taziba will also raise the questions in general for a discussion with everybody, just for setting the scene. Without much further ado, I want to introduce you to Taziba Josiah. He is our facilitator tonight. He will be joined by the chairperson of the Botswana chapter, Mbako Sabati. Taziba Josiah, if I may introduce him, has a Bachelor of Accounting of the University of Botswana. He also holds a Master's of Business Administration from Mankosa. He has completed the Senior Management Development Program at the USB 8, our Executive Development, Postgraduate Certificate in Risk Management from the Botswana Accountancy College. Taziba holds a certified Balanced Scorecard graduate from the Balanced Scorecard Institute. His experience includes 4 years in the Botswana Defence Force, 10 years in the Botswana Power Corporation. And he's a manager in accounting and finance and industry for more than 10 years. He's a facilities and fleet manager, and in that position, he's responsible for the entire corporation's fleet and facilities, the strategic direction, procurement, and maintenance. Taziba's skills include strategic procurement, management, facilities management, budget, and then he is also doing coaching. Taziba, thank you very much for arranging for us our speaker tonight, together with Mr. Sabati, and I wish you well facilitating this session. Over to you, Taziba. Taziba, can you unmute?
Thank you so much, Crystal. Good evening, everyone. Like Crystal have just said, we are really privileged to have you join this session, of which it's always information sharing. And this goes a long way in ensuring that we share information within the region and globally so that we can drive all our desires in the industry wherever we are. So I can say we are really grateful to the University of Stellenbosch for continuing to support this type of session, even in these trying times of COVID-19. However, let me quickly try to manage time. Our speaker, Dr. Mbo, he had to rush to his place to try and get things right, of which he is joining right now. But as Crystal has said, we are going to be kickstarting this session with some discussion around the topic, which is within the state-owned enterprises in our governments, wherever we are. There is a role that these state-owned enterprises play in our governments. The discussion, you'd find that from all corners in terms of the role the state-owned enterprise play. Some governments, they use the state-owned enterprises to drive or implement projects in a fast-tracked manner. And some governments use state-owned enterprises to ensure that what ministries are driving can be fast-tracked, like I've just said. And there's a discussion around that aspect to say, are they really working for our governments? Or are the state enterprises really an ideal? And one would ask a question to say, if they are not ideal then, but are we getting the right service from the ministries that the government directly use to serve its citizens? And as we start the discussion while awaiting the speaker.
I've joined.
Sorry.
Okay, sir.
I've joined Mbako.
Dr. Mbo has joined us.
Yes, please, I've joined.
Thank you.
Okay.
Let me say, because the speaker is now joined, can I quickly introduce the speaker? We have in our midst Dr. Mbako Mbo. He is the speaker for today's session. Dr. Mbo graduated with a PhD in management and administration with the University of Stellenbosch in the year 2017. Dr. Mbo's research interests are in the state-owned enterprises with focus in the developing world. He has published some international journals and conferences in the subject. Dr. Mbo is also a chartered accountant. He's also a chartered accountant.
Gaziba, are you still there? I'm not sure, maybe there's
I think maybe he might be having some internet problems.
Yes.
I think just to take over and continue introducing Dr. Mbo, as Taziba have said, Dr. Mbo is a chartered accountant and has spent a greater part of his career working in state-owned enterprises in and outside Botswana, specializing in finance, fiduciary work, as well as investment risk. He also previously taught at undergraduate level at the University of Botswana. Currently, he's a CFO of the Standard Chartered Bank in Botswana. I think it will be a much pleasure for us to learn greatly from Dr. Mbo. Dr. Mbo, over to you with the presentation.
Thank you so much for the introductions. Let me start off by sincerely and deeply apologizing for joining in late. I started a minor dental procedure at 2. It was supposed to finish at 4. It's only finishing now. So I'm very sorry for that. Yeah, so I believe that we will be sharing, I'll just get straight into the subject. I believe we'll be sharing the screen.
Will you be sharing, Dr. Mbo?
I thought you will be sharing from your end. Can you please go ahead and share from your end the slides?
I can share.
Thank you so much. Great. While we are still waiting for the slides to come up, let me just sort of get into the topic a bit and sort of try to put things into perspective. The topic itself seems to question. When you really look at the topic, the way I've structured it, it seems to question the relevance of state-owned enterprises. I put it that way deliberately. Because of one reason mainly. The reason being that generally when people talk about state-owned enterprises, they talk about entities, they talk about organizations. What we don't normally hear is a discussion around the state enterprise as a sector. So that is where this topic is coming from. So by no means is the topic really suggesting that we don't need that sector. We don't need the state-owned enterprises. The topic is really igniting a discussion, which is going to put us in a position where we can introspect and ask ourselves if they are playing the role they're supposed to be playing. If the size of the sector itself globally and in individual markets, is it really the right one? So that is just the topic put into perspective. So we can, thank you so much. I see the slides are now here. Let's start off the discussion. And as I really explained before, when in a build up to this discussion, my understanding and my expectation is that this is really going to be a conversation. It is not going to be necessarily me speaking to you or talking at you. It's just going to be a discussion. It's going to be a discussion because obviously this type of discussions in my mind, they have to build to something. I structured this topic at the end of the topic. Now you see we have got trends and realities. The idea is to end up publishing the same topic, but now looking at facts and figures. So this is sort of a build up to what I hopefully think will end up being a publication. So there's the poll question there. Do you believe state-owned enterprises are still relevant? Please take you may go ahead the question now. Two options, yes or no. Do you really think that SOEs, here now I'm talking to the SOEs as themselves, as entities. Do you think they are relevant? They are still relevant? We will give just some 30 seconds and then we get on with the discussion. Okay, are we ready to look at the results? Can you take a look at the results, please? %73% of you think that they are still relevant. This is not really surprising. I will tell you that from my own research work, I have in all circumstances recommended or concluded that indeed these are still relevant. It will be very interesting to hear maybe from one or two people who think that they are no longer relevant. What's informing that view? What experiences have you had that lead you to thinking that they're no longer relevant? Anyone, please? Anyone, please, who thinks that they are not, SOEs are not relevant? Are we sure?
It will be very difficult for one to say that they are not relevant. But I think my submission will be that it will depend on the role that they are playing, because where the private sector is capable to deliver the service, my belief is that the state enterprise should not play in that space. But it should only be playing where the private sector cannot participate.
Thank you very much for that. Much of that later. Can you please go to the next slide and move on with the presentation? Please proceed. Let's go to the next slide. Right. Now, let's start from the beginning. Really, why did we have the why do we have the state enterprise sector? Why do we have state-owned enterprises? So I think this is the obvious, really. If you look around, if you talk to governments, if you talk to leaders in the state-owned enterprise or state enterprise sector, these are the reasons that normally or that frequently come up. They are there to stimulate development. They are there to put up the heavy capital outlay that is known to be required, or that is known to be necessary for certain industries. They are there to to facilitate trade, rail transportation as an example. They also are common in industries that are economically important or socially important or socio-politically important, but without the ability to attract private sector capital. Sometimes we see a lot of them. We see a lot of governments starting state-owned enterprises just as a strategic move. If you look at most of sovereign wealth funds, they are actually in this particular category. They are also an important vehicle for partial commercialization. We know that we pay for electricity, we pay for water, we pay for sanitation, and in most cases we don't necessarily pay economically reflective rates, or the rates that we pay do not necessarily cover the entire cost of doing so. So that on its own means that the private sector may not necessarily find it attractive to operate certain industries. But at the same time, you may not necessarily find that the public sector machinery is the best to commercialize a service. So that is where now you find some middle ground. You find the state-owned enterprise sector playing to bridge that gap. So as the colleague just said now, they mainly exist to bridge the gap between the private sector and the public sector. So on the other hand, you have the public sector, which is really focused on providing public goods. And normally you don't provide public goods for financial return. You provide public goods for social return. On the other hand, you have private capital. Private capital really is looking for returns. You put a cent, you need 2 cents back. That's just how life works. So in between, you may then find that the state-owned enterprise or the state enterprise sector comes in to fill this gap. Next slide, please. Now let's take a sector view to it. So far, we have been talking to state-owned enterprises as organizations or as entities. Now we want to look at them as a sector. So in the first chart there, what you see is it's sort of a global picture of what you will find in terms of you will find in low income developing countries. So SOE so far by asset value in infrastructure. In this particular pie chart, we are looking only at infrastructure. 55% of the investments that are in the infrastructural industries or infrastructure heavy industries are still operated by SOEs, whereas government still has about 28%, and then the private sector is sort of growing its share there at 17%. So the statement that I put also there is from OECD. OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperating and Developing Countries. It's just sort of a club of certain countries that are economically advanced. So even in their space, you still find that there's $2 trillion worth of capital, $2 trillion worth of capital that is actually associated with SOEs. They employ over 6 million people in these particular countries. So you can still see that the sector is still large. The sector is actually growing, and that is not necessarily to say it is still systematically important. But what we know is that the sector is still large, the sector is still growing. So today, what we are looking at, the topic that we are discussing now, is to interrogate their importance. So we are not arguing about their existence. We are not arguing about their dominance in certain industries. These are the capital heavy industries. But what we are interrogating is their importance from a socio-political perspective as well as from an economical perspective. So you can still, you can please move to the next slide. All right. Now, here we are going to take another poll question that will then lead us to the next discussion, and then we will move on to another slide, and then a couple of other, 2 or more poll questions, and then we'll open up the discussion. So the poll question now is that should governments be in business? Remember, the first question was, are SOEs still relevant? I think amongst the attendance today, there's an overwhelming majority at 73% of you who believe that they are still important. In the last few minutes of my discussion, we have looked at their existence. We have looked at how we have looked at the picture globally and as well as in developed countries, the level of investments that is associated with SOEs. But now the question that I want us to zoom into is, should governments own businesses? This, I think this poll question is related to what a colleague said earlier. The colleague was saying that in his views, SOEs should only operate in industries or in markets where the private sector is not operating. So this is sort of an extension of that view, but now in form of a question: should governments own businesses? Let's look at the responses, please. This is a tough one. 54% of you believe that governments should own businesses. 46% of you believe that governments should not own businesses. Can I have a view or two from those of you who believe that governments should own businesses? Anyone, please?
There.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I believe they should own businesses because some services, if they don't run at a profit, they will still be costing the taxpayer anyhow. So it would be ideal if they would actually run them at a profit, which for me, that is a business sense of it, rather than just burdening the taxpayer with the tax bill to fund them every year.
Yeah, but then what if governments are to own businesses, why should government be concerned about having a successful private sector?
Uh-huh.
Only,
Now,
only to turn around and compete with it.
okay, it would not necessarily be competition. You guys gave a good example of areas such as your railway line or your airline industry, for example, or your utilities. So you find that you can't expect private sector to run those things because the overhead cost of just setting up those things are just unaffordable for the private sector. But you can also make them to be government because you know that if you make them purely government, they will probably give us bad results in that sense. So there are certain sectors that the government can run business in them, and there are some that they can't. All those that, especially that where you need to reach a wider a sector of the population, you can run them as a business because private sectors probably won't reach those people. Take the postal services, for example. Let me compare with the banking industry. In the banking industry, for example, there are some areas where there's not a branch there, but with the postal sector, for example, there is a branch there. So there are some places that the private sector won't reach.
Yeah, I subscribe to your views. I subscribe to your views. So what I, the way I look at it from where I stand is that there's a difference between running a business for the intention of owning a business, as compared to running a business for the intention of commercializing a public good. So that is why sometimes when you extend this topic and then you try to discuss performance measurement in SOEs, it becomes a very difficult topic. If you say in the private sector, what defines good performance, the matrices are always clear. But for SOEs or for the state-owned enterprise, or for the state enterprise sector, it becomes a little bit muddy. For instance, if you are to take our power utility, for instance, if you go to the Minister of Finance today, and then you say, how are they performing? They will tell you that this is probably one of the worst performers in the country. But if you go to my village, where there has been an extension of power networks at a fraction of the true cost, they will tell you that, look, this is the best performing entity. So so those kind of things, those kind of, you take a stakeholder view to the state-owned enterprise sector or the state enterprise sector, you then begin to see a picture emerging, a picture that says maybe these things are not necessarily businesses. So that is what makes them unique enough to warrant a recognition of a sector within the economy that is called the state enterprise sector. It is something that will then make us understand that when we say the state-owned enterprise sector or the state enterprise sector, we shouldn't expect businesses in there. We should expect entities that have been set up to run commercialized public goods. Now the problem is when we start having businesses in there, that's where the problem comes. At the beginning, I think we flashed a slide. At the beginning, we sort of looked at why we had state-owned enterprises mushrooming all the way from World War II. They have grown many folds, and we have looked at the reasons why. And the reasons have always been clear. They are certain industries that needs huge capital outlay. The government has to step in. There are certain services that can be commercialized. The public sector machinery cannot do that. So you have all those reasons coming in. But you see, here's the problem. We have state-owned enterprises owning businesses. They are selling cell phones. They are selling SIM cards. They are selling cabbages. They are polishing diamonds. They are selling shoes in other countries. And you then ask yourself, is it what we expect from the state enterprise sector? You see what I mean? In Botswana, we have got a whole government owning a cell phone company. What is it that that warrants for instance, the government to be owning a cell phone company. It's a discussion that can be held, but the content of that discussion will be totally different from a discussion that would say, why is the government owning an airline, or why is the government owning a power utility? You see, so this is what puts the state enterprise sector as a unique sector that needs to begin to have a discussion that is focused on it. And we need a lot of research work going into this particular field. I'm sure, I hope I'm not sort of clouding issues here, but in short, what I'm trying to say is that in my view, I would agree with those that say government should not own businesses, and we should, and it should really start with us defining state-owned enterprises differently. They are state-owned enterprises. They are not private businesses. They exist to run commercialized public goods. Can we move to the next slide, please?
Sorry, it just seems to be stuck.
No problem, no problem.
There we go.
There we go. Thank you so much. Now, the topic speaks to, or the topic seeks to speak to trends. We spoke to trends, we spoke about trends. So in here, I'm trying to sort of show trends of SOEs by equity value across the world. And in this particular one, I am removing China. This particular graph has removed China, and it's for a specific reason. We know that majority of commercial activity in China is really run by state-owned enterprises. And we also know that elsewhere around the globe, there are lots and lots of Chinese entities, and most of these are government owned. So for that particular reason, I consider China as an outlier, and I adopted a graph or a pie chart that sort of excludes China. So now here is the picture. 26% of these guys are in finance. And when you look at these entities, if you are to take time and drill down into this 26%, it's not really like you're going to find entities that are meant for financial inclusion, which is what I believe that if a government is to own a financial institution, it should be for the purposes of financial inclusion, which is what our own, I think, Botswana Postal Services is doing. This is what you would understand, but this is not what the majority of this 26% is. The majority of this 26% are multinational corporations, finance houses with big muscles. They are going around the world, putting capital and huge investments are around, and also you have sovereign wealth funds that are also splashing funds, splashing capital across global markets. So this is the picture that we are having to deal with. Another 18% remains in transportation. Yes, fine. For transportation, you still find a lot of sea and rail and sea, which is something that one could really understand why they would be there. But look at primary services. 17% are still in primary services, and this is also where we look at the same problem, but from a different perspective. Earlier on, I discussed a problem when governments get into business and they crowd out the private sector, which is not necessarily a good thing. We have got a similar problem on the public sector side. We have seen certain public services turned into, or certain public sector departments turned into state-owned enterprises. And then you ask yourself, why? They are never going to break even as a starter. They are never going to attract the level of resources and including human resources that is requisite to run a business. And I don't want to be giving examples, but even in Botswana, we have seen a lot of this happening, where you wake up one morning, a government department has been turned into a parastatal, and then they are offering these primary services. And these are the kind of things that now will lead to a swelling state enterprise sector. So there will be two things here. You have got a sector that is getting crowded by entities that have been turned from public sector departments or from government departments into parastatals. You also then have in there a mixture of businesses that are owned by government by reason of history, but now having lost relevance totally from a government ownership perspective. So this is the kind of picture that we have. Of course, we have got 3% real estate. What is the government's business in real estate? We have got governments around the world, certainly in Africa, where you find a block of residential flats owned by government. What is the business of government owning residential flats that they rent out to the public at market rates? You see, this is where now the whole thing starts to lose relevance, and that's where the problem is. The waterfall that you see behind, I mean below that particular pie chart, it's just a creation of what we have been seeing all the way from World War, certainly. So what we are seeing there, we have seen a move. We have seen a move from traditional industries. Traditional industries. This is when we talk of sea and rail. We talk of postal services. We talk of traditional fixed line telephony. We speak to strategic mining and so on and so forth. So these are the traditional sectors that we have known the state-owned enterprises to operate in. So that is generally the blue line that you see there. So on the other side, you have entities that are newer, like sort of new. What do we say? How do I put this? Entities that are owned by government, that are operating in industries or in markets that are traditionally not known to be reserved for state-owned enterprises. If you take, for instance, the telecommunications sector as an example, there has been a traditional reason why the government, a whole range of reasons why governments would have owned telecommunications industries or telecommunications entities. And some of those reasons, obviously the first one being the heavy capital outlay, where the population was not really supporting a business case. The government still has to step in because it's a critical industry, it's a critical sector for economic advancement. The other reason being that obviously for political reasons, no government would really want to let go of its backbone infrastructure in terms of telecommunications. So in the context of telecommunications, for instance, it would be the transmitters, the large backbone, the large backbone infrastructure itself. You find the same thing in the railway line, where the national rail tracks themselves will never really be privatized. You find the same thing in the power industry, where distribution can be privatized, where generation can be privatized, but you'll never really find a government that has privatized transmission. So why I'm saying this is that we have seen advancements, we have seen transformative changes in all these industries. In the telecommunications industries, we have seen it possible for the government to be able to strip out the backbone assets and form a company that will then run it. We have Bofinet in Botswana. If we have Bofinet, why would government want to own B-Mobile as an example? We have seen those advancements in the power sector as well. It has become very possible to distinguish and distinctively identify transmission assets, differentiated from distribution assets, and separated totally from generation assets. In the railway space, we have seen the same thing. We have seen governments forming courier companies that are owned by railway by the railway line companies themselves. So it's still possible for the government to still hold on to the railway tracks, but still you privatize the distribution of goods from the railway line to various localities. So what I'm trying to say here, I'm challenging the view that the view that certain industries are still relevant under government ownership. I'm still also challenging the view that we don't have markets for certain industries that governments traditionally have operated. So, for instance, if you cross the border into South Africa, MTN is one of the most successful mobile companies across the world. Why is the government still holding on to Telkom? Why can't we just let the thing go in terms of at least the mobile business? So these are the issues that we are seeing. So the worrying trend that we are seeing is that state-owned enterprise, this sector is growing, but it is growing in the direction of entities and markets that have not traditionally been known to be operated by SOEs. Whereas it is shrinking because of dominance, by reason of dominance on the traditional sectors where it is actually supposed to be operating. We can move to the next slide. I think there's a poll question there. Let's take the poll questions 3 and 4. I promise you these are the last. Let's go to the next. I think this one we've looked at it. Should governments be in business? We've looked at it. All right, let's go to the next poll question that says SOEs do create geopolitical tensions. Do you agree or do you disagree? Let's get some 30 seconds. Do SOEs create geopolitical tensions?
They do.
Okay, let's look at the results. Interesting. 86% say they do create geopolitical tensions. Can we get a few examples? Anyone, please? Any example of a case where an SOE or SOEs or a group of them have caused geopolitical tensions? Okay, I challenge you, go read about the Dubai Sea Company, its investment in the Americas, and try see what you can make out of that. But generally, the examples that this is actually coming out in a book that I'm writing with some other people in development finance. It's a chapter in sovereign. There's a whole chapter in sovereign wealth funds that I've worked on, and one of the things that I speak to in that particular chapter, it's what we have seen coming out of the 2007-8 financial crisis. We saw banks failing. At the back of that, we saw governments jumping in to sort of bail those banks out. On the surface, there's nothing that sounds untoward in that particular move by governments. But here's the problem. These were governments that were owned by foreign governments. I mean, these were bailouts from foreign governments. Just to give an example, you've got a bank that is operating in Botswana, owned in Botswana. It has got exposures in all the sectors in Botswana, and it banks a lot of very systematically important organizations in Botswana. It has also invested in other countries who have got bilateral cooperations with Botswana. And then from nowhere, there's this other company which comes in a transaction that doesn't make clear commercial sense, coming in to buy out that particular bank just because it is failing. And when you look at the commercial thesis of the transaction, you just don't get a sense that this is a business transaction. And there is a lot of mistrust that normally comes. If you read up on sovereign wealth funds generally, this is the biggest problem that we have observed in the market, where you get a lot of questionable investments by government. Then you have issues of trust. Then you have this. Then you have that. Particularly in industries like telecommunications, they may be privatized. But even if they are privatized, then you tell me, why would a foreign government want to own a telecommunications company in a foreign territory? The same thing applies to pharmaceuticals. We have a lot of those problems in pharmaceuticals. We also have a lot of those tensions that are not necessarily spoken about in the defense, military and defense industries. So these are the problems that in many cases we face when we try to understand why would foreign governments own enterprises in foreign jurisdictions. Thanks, we can move to the last slide. I think this will be our last slide. Yeah, the last slide, the one before this one. Sorry. Thank you. This is the one. Now, this is meant to open the discussion. What do we do with the sector? We need a gradual, a coordinated, a policy-based, and an integrated approach to scaling down the sector. Scaling down the sector means that we have come to a point where we realize that this is a very important sector, but it has become too big for its relevance. It is now in business. It is now providing public goods, which are suitable to be provided for under the public sector machinery. So we are basically saying that it is just losing relevance. Its role, its defined role, its traditional role still remains relevant, but the actual role that they are actually playing now is diminishing, or is tainting the original roles for which the sector was actually crafted. If, for instance, when I say an integrated approach and a coordinated approach, I do not necessarily mean from a country perspective. So it has to start from a sector. From a sector in the sense that in many countries, not only in Botswana, in many countries, particularly in Africa, you find that there are 2, 3, 4 entities, so state-owned enterprises operating in the same sector. You will have BHC operating in the real estate. You will have Botswana Railway Property operating in the real estate sector. You will have another one operating in that particular sector. You will have BDC owning a lot of real estate, and it's also 100% owned by government. So it needs a coordinated approach from that perspective. It also needs an intersectoral integration and coordination, where you find that there are 2 separate entities that are operating in different sectors, but there is a lot of synergies that could actually be realized. I think in the case of Botswana, the example that comes to mind, you will find that we've got Botswana Savings Bank. You have Botswana Postal Services. You have Botswana Couriers. And I think there's something going on there that is likely to result in a very nice picture if it is done well. So that is the intersectoral approach to integration that I'm speaking to. But that is not enough. You also need to have it coordinated from a global perspective. Whichever way you look at it, geopolitical tensions are by their nature a Cold War of some sort. So if you look at the sovereign wealth funds, they have come together and decided to come up with class rules. They call them the San Diego principles. If you Google them, you will actually find that San Diego principles were set up or were sort of formulated to try and monitor the behavior of these guys, so that if a fund comes into Botswana tomorrow to try, if say IDC from South Africa rocks up in Botswana tomorrow and they say we want to fund a dam, we should know exactly what is it that they are looking for. So that's the type of global integration and global coordination that would typically help. So in the state, in terms of the size of that graph sort of shows what we need to do. The orange graph there shows that we need to scale down. And when we scale down, we should be able to identify that there are entities that should be assisted by state. These are systematically important, too important to fail organizations that needs to be assisted by the state. But the assistance should be policy based, not necessarily tied to any other cycles, but rather informed by policy that the government comes up with. What comes to mind here will obviously be in entities or industries like the power sector. If you have, even if you're going to have the private sector operating in the power sector, for instance, generation companies, a generation company as a private company will still need to be assisted by government, but that assistance will not necessarily come in the form of money or capital outlay. It should come in the form of power purchase agreements. As an example, if I'm a private investor and I want to set up a power utility or a power generating unit somewhere, I should be able to go to government and say, before I put my money, please assist me by a power purchasing agreement. And then I will be sure that I will be able to realize my return. So that is what I say. In there, we should find state-assisted entities. We should also have state-enabled state-enabled industries. And when I say state-enabled industries, I'm really trying to get away from this notion that an entity can be a strong entity when it's enabled by government. Even in Botswana, that's why I say sometimes in Botswana, our private sector is too fragile, because there are too many companies which, if you take government business away from them, they collapse the next day. So that is not a sustainable way of running or enabling industries or enabling entities. The more sustainable way is to enable at industry level. Put up a legislation that only enables that particular industry and let the free market rules operate. And then we have state-dependent industries. It's a state-dependent industry. It's not helping anybody. It's milking the government of its taxes or tax revenues. It's just an eyesore to the public. Just close those things and let them go. I don't want to mention names, but I'm sure we all know that we do have a few of those in Botswana. There are a few of those almost in every other country in Africa, where you just have to, you have got entities that can actually shut doors for 3 months and nobody will realize that this company has actually been closed for the past 3 months. So those are the companies those are the entities that governments just need to shut down and move on. And that's just what I wanted to discuss with you. It's obviously a smaller portion of the bigger discussion on SOE reforms. And thank you very much for your attention. We can have a discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Mbo. There's this question. You just mentioned about PPAs, that is the power purchase agreements that maybe can help in trying to scale down the participation of state-owned enterprises in government. But there's this aspect of the PPAs requesting or requiring very high guarantees from government, and this delays that process of trying to scale down the state-owned enterprises from relying on government. So what's your take on that aspect?
Good question. That's why I speak about state-enabled industries. If I pick the example of the power industry and the PPA story, you will agree with me that power investments are huge, and you are talking of a minimum maybe 15 years for you to get your payback. And for a private sector, and then you find that a lot of countries like in Botswana, where we operate a single buyer model, there's only one customer you're going to have, but you still need the private sector in that particular industry. If you don't have that guarantee, and that guarantee not in form of a financial explicit guarantee, that guarantee from the form of in the form of a government saying, for as long as you are going to operate your business here on commercial principles as a private sector, paying taxes, employing people, and everything else to do with you being a private company, you abide by that. I will guarantee that I will buy your products, because if I don't buy your products, no one else will buy your products. So that is why we need a state-enabled industry in that particular case.
Thank you, sir. There is a question from Lynn Deacon. I think it's more or less similar. What he's saying is, he agrees with the establishment of SOEs for as long as they are efficiently run. When they are failing to be efficiently run, he feels private sector can then take on. What's your take again on this one?
The general consensus, pick any research paper on SOEs. Everybody who has looked at SOEs will tell you that the biggest problem with SOEs is poor performance. And that poor performance emanates from poor governance. That is a well-known fact. Now, in terms of us saying that if an SOE is failing, then it's an indicator that a private sector entity should take over. It's a broader discussion. What I would look at it slightly differently. I would say that a state-owned enterprise may fail, not necessarily because of the commercial story, but because of governance and management issues that we know SOEs to be linked to. But it doesn't follow naturally that if a private sector company comes in, they will be successful as a commercial entity. It may be that if you turn the performance of that particular SOE around, it may actually perform better, but still it doesn't take away the fact that a private the industry itself or the market itself is not ripe for private sector. In one of my research work, really, I focused on developing a performance measurement model for SOEs and a performance improvement model for SOEs. So it's a very broad and very, very deep topic that would need a different session on its own.
Thank you, sir. There is a question again posed by